Well, a change in the election result in the government, of course, has meant some changes for the vanquished, including the Nationals. They elected a new leader early in the week, and that's David Littleproud, who's been good enough to join me now. Thanks very much for your time. Congratulations, first of all, on the role. You mentioned making sure the Nationals were taking things from the sensible centre. Does that mean, in your view, the Nationals had drifted somewhat from the sensible centre?
No. The sensible centre is centre-right, Tom, and that's what we've always held and that's what we'll always hold. We don't need to go to any extremities. We need to stick the course and make sure we bring this thing called common sense to Canberra. And while there's a lot of commentary and a lot of stuff on the dark web trying to interpret it, that's what the sensible centre is. The National Party's values and principles haven't changed. We've held firm. We've done well in the election. There are emerging threats that we need to face up to, but we won't be deviating. And I think what we've been able to demonstrate over the last 3 years is exactly that.
OK, so no change in principle. What does change under your leadership?
Well, obviously, what the decision was on Monday was not a reflection on Barnaby Joyce's performance. He did an outstanding job, but what it was a reflection on the fact that we need to start our journey towards 2025 and who was prepared to put their hand up to go through to 2025. That work had to start now, not in 2 years' time or 18 months' time, and it had to give time for the leader that was prepared to go to 2025 the opportunity to also put their team around them so that they've got the time to be able to put the policy settings right, to be able to articulate that, and to be able to be out in the field and being able to enunciate that clearly so that people can understand that we haven't changed our values. We're using this thing called common sense, and we're going to make a real difference for regional rural Australia as their conscience and their voice in Canberra.
OK, so you're leader now because Barnaby Joyce wasn't going to go until 2025. That's the only reason. Is that what you're saying?
Well, Barnaby made it clear that he didn't want to go through to 2025. Under our constitution, the way in which the National Party, our standing orders operate within our party room, is that I felt the most appropriate time to put my hand up was immediately after election when all the positions are spilled. That's the culture of the National Party, a unique one, but a good one, regardless of the result. And so part of my thinking was that we needed to make sure that we needed to look to the future. And when I look to the future, I'll also be drawing on the past of Barnaby Joyce and other leaders like Michael McCormack to make sure that they can nurture us. This was a transition that Barnaby wanted to take, but they have to be part of that transition as well. And I think that we'll be able to draw on that experience to be able to achieve that as a national party to make us stronger and better into the 2025 election.
How much a part of it? Will Barnaby Joyce be part of the shadow ministry?
Well, look, Peter Dutton and I are just working through those issues now, and obviously some of those core principles that are important to the National Party, and we're working through that as quickly as we can, and we'll obviously be making further announcements in the future. But obviously, Peter has values and principles he wants to protect on behalf of the Liberal Party, and I on behalf of the National Party.
But it's your decision.
Through that in a respectful way.
You can make the decision. It's not Peter Dutton's decision.
Well, you're right, but obviously we will need to get to a juncture where we'll have an agreement around what our shadow cabinet and positions will look like, but also policy settings that are important to Nationals, that there's an appreciation that the Liberal Party understands that, and we'll have to work through those issues that are important, as there are for issues with them, and we're happy and being constructive and working through that before we get to any final juncture.
Does Barnaby Joyce want to be part of the front bench?
Well, that's a conversation I'll have with Barnaby, but I've made it clear that...
So you haven't had that yet?
It's important. Well, there's no coalition agreement struck yet. So once I know what I'm dealing with and that we're comfortable with the settings of that coalition agreement, then I'll have further conversations. But I've made it clear it's important that we draw on those experiences of not only Barnaby Joyce, but also Michael McCormack, both former Deputy Prime Ministers. They've got a lot of experience to draw upon, but we also need to make sure that the next generation are brought through and that we nurture those to make sure that the future leaders of the National Parties are there. And that's the culture of the National Party. And I think Barnaby should be congratulated for being open and honest about the fact that he didn't have the energy to go through to 25, but he will be part of this party room and be a very influential and important part of our party room moving forward in guiding us into the future.
So when we look at the Nationals, your policy direction, your rhetoric, whatever it might be, do you see any clear differences between the Nationals under Barnaby Joyce and the Nationals under you?
Well, I think that the party room is primacy in the National Party. So all that changes is the leader around that party room and articulating that policy setting, that vision that our party room brings forward and creates that environment for it. That's the culture of the National Party, where it's a little bit different. The primacy of the party room rings true, and my job is to make sure that I create the environment for that to prosper and to bring forward those policy settings, and then to articulate them, whether that be in a coalition arrangement or whether that be just out on the streets articulating what the National Party stands for. That's how we've operated for over 100 years, and that's how we'll continue to operate.
Do you think the Nationals, though, need to be wary of staying modern and relevant to your constituents today, which are changing, and the nature of life in a lot of these regional towns is changing too, and the types of voters are changing?
Of course, we're evolving with our community, and that's why it's important to be connected to your community, and our members do that as local champions. But what we've shown and demonstrated under the leadership of Barnaby Joyce, when we had a tough decision about net zero, and Barnaby led us through that, is that we didn't turn our back on coal, or we didn't turn our back on mining, we didn't turn our back on gas. We came up with a sensible, common sense solution of technology. I live in an electorate with 4 coal-fired power stations, one of which is adopting carbon capture storage. Isn't that a common sense way that we can actually reduce our emissions, protect the baseload power that we need, protect those jobs, but also look to the new jobs? And that was what the National Party brought to that conversation around net zero. And there's a lot that are trying to tear us down about that. But that's the practical application of being in government and being able to put practical solutions, because had we not, everyone was going to pay close to up to 3% on their mortgage.
Okay.
Capital markets were factoring them in, both public and private, and farmers were going to get less for their commodities. So we've come up with a practical solution to solve an international problem.
There's a gas crisis that's landed on Labor's doorstep. Presumably you're not blaming Labor for it, they've just come into power. So what are the practical solutions you think they should be putting forward?
Well, supply is a big start, and I think you've got to understand that the moratoriums that are in place in some states are holding that back. The federal government, in conjunction with the Northern Territory government, was able to get a development in the Beetaloo Basin up that'll add more supply to it. We've been making sure that we've had practical solutions around carbon capture storage to protect existing gas industries, but also our coal-fired power stations, and making sure they can be modernised. And I think there's also an opportunity. There's an opportunity as us as political leaders to take away the angst in the community and create an environment, a conversation around alternative energy like nuclear. And we need to make sure that we educate before we legislate. And we did a lot of polling on nuclear some 2 years ago, and the broad community doesn't accept it because, unfortunately, much of their education of it has come from Chernobyl and Fukushima, and in some cases, which came through in the research, was even The Simpsons. So you've got to educate before you legislate, but we should create an environment. And this is where the Prime Minister is saying he wants to create a new political construct where we have mature conversations about this. Well, as a political leader of this parliament, I want to put my hand up and say, I'm in. Let's create the constructive environment with Labor.
Okay, well, just on that though, I mean, your side of politics hasn't really been up for that conversation as well. Have you had conversations with Peter Dutton saying we've got to put nuclear on the table?
Well, that's one of the discussions that Peter and I are having, but it's in a respectful way. So
you are having that conversation now about nuclear energy and having that possibly part of a coalition platform?
Well, what I'm saying is the National Party is comfortable to have that conversation around small-scale nuclear now. We feel that conversation is not locking us into it. When the National Party is not sitting there and saying, we demand these things to be built within the next 2-3 years. What we're saying is we have to bring the community with us. So create the environment of a conversation whereby all political sides put away their predetermined dispositions or assertions for small-scale nuclear and come together in a constructive way in which Anthony Albanese is being
espoused. What was Peter Dutton's response
opportunity for
when you were raising that?
Well, obviously Peter and I have discussions about that, and he wants to make sure that he can bring his party with it, but we're two separate parties, and that's not a bad thing. Diversity of ideas in a coalition is actually a healthy and constructive way to operate, but the National Party, we're at a juncture where we believe small-scale nuclear is one where we should have that conversation, where this new technology, we're not talking about having big nuclear power stations on every corner, we're talking about small-scale modular, using common sense, but creating an environment for constructive conversation. And I'll be putting my hand out to Anthony Albanese and every political leader to say, let's create the environment to bring the community with us. We're not locking ourselves into this, we're just creating an environment for a conversation to start that journey.
Is there something inherently broken with the setup of our energy sector when we've got power plants right now in Australia struggling to get enough gas, some coal-fired power plants struggling to get enough coal, and yet we're shipping the stuff off as quickly as we can? Is there something broken about that system?
Well, and this is what we saw, and I'm in Dalby at the moment in the Strat Basin, where the Bligh government and the Rudd government approved coal seam gas overnight, effectively all for export. There was no domestic consumption brought into any of the conversations about how these gas companies could come and develop these reserves. To their credit, the state government about 4 or 5 years ago opened up some more reserves solely for domestic use. And this is where state governments need to work more constructively with federal governments. And the Northern Territory government did that with Beetaloo Basin. We thank them for that.
So is that where you see it going? It's got to be future supplies that include domestic use rather than going back on existing contracts. Is that sovereign issue one that we shouldn't broach?
You've got to protect the sovereignty, Tom, but you can use this thing called common sense, whereby you can actually open up reserves destined just for domestic supply. It's not a new idea, but we need the states to lose much of the moratoriums they've got. Queensland has done much of the heavy lifting, and some of the constraints from Queensland is the ability to get as much gas down there because of the pipes. Okay. So what you've got to understand is we need other states to come on this with us and come up and have a look at how Queensland has done it. I think Queensland made some mistakes to start with, but the coal seam gas industry here in Queensland has done things responsibly, and that is a way forward for us to learn and to try and build that supply.
Just finally, what about discussions on a PRRT? We're exporting so much of this gas, and as governments making very little from it. Could that be looked at as well?
Oh, look, I think what we want to see as a government, what we proved was less taxes. What we see is that if we're able to put the environment and infrastructure around the Australian people and Australian industry, they'll do the heavy lifting and we'll actually get the returns without having to put our hands too deep into their pockets. I think we need to look through these things. I think
just not getting those returns.
Well, more broadly, Tom, I think we need to be bold enough to have a conversation about our taxation system. But I think singling one out just on the fly isn't sensible. I think it should be looked more broadly across our entire taxation system rather than just singling one out because of a current circumstance.
Well, that's an interesting conversation, unfortunately one for another day. David Littleproud, Nationals leader, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, mate.